Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortunate he has been, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
Небо утреннего стяг в жизни важен. Первый шаг, слышишь, реют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome. It is the evening of the 7th of December 2023, and we are back with a live stream for you this evening, dealing with some questions that have come up over the last 24 hours or so, and a couple of updates on various different things as well that we've talked about and that are somewhat ongoing issues. So, we have with us today in the chat so far, we have Dingo Ate Me Baby, the man with the finest username in the West. We have Banana Bender, Irish Partisan, who's coming to us from a bitterly cold and icy Minsk. And you are at least in a free country, though, Irish Partisan, I must observe, unlike the stunning dullness and horror of the decline of empire, which we in Britain have the displeasure to witness all around us on a daily basis now. Good afternoon to Jay out there in Norfolk, Virginia, where it's also chilly. And Roddy, good evening to you. Banana Bender asks the question, any predictions on when the British working class will rise up? Well, answer me on a postcard if you know before I do. The advanced industrial nations haven't done shit since the Soviet Union was founded. Well, slight disagreement with you there. There were near-revolutionary events immediately after the Soviet Union was founded in Britain. These were reliably destroyed by the actions of the hierarchy of the trade union movement, talking about the general strike of 1926. Again, there was a revolutionary mood in Britain in 1945 that was bought off altogether too easily with the reforms of the post-war period. There was revolutionary potential in Britain, France and Italy from around about 66 to 67 through to, in the British case, about the end of 85 or the middle of 85. And there was, of course, the events in France, which were moving in a revolutionary direction. Same thing in Italy. Some potential in West Germany, but I don't want to overstate that. There was also potential for a genuine socialist revolution in Spain. The problem in each of these countries wasn't that the working class didn't move into action. It wasn't that there wasn't a mood there to fight for something. It's that all of the organizations that are supposed to represent the working class, that are supposed to provide working class leadership, ultimately decided that they would sell the movement out, compromise, go for reforms that they often didn't even get or that vanished very, very quickly. And the prime culprits, of course, being the old Second International parties, but you've also got to blame the communist parties which followed them, which became exactly like them. So in the post-World War II period, you had in France and Italy big movements of the working class that were led by communist parties which decided to capitulate to reformism and were either gone or irrelevant within 30 years of doing so. Gone from a position in the late 60s when they could have made revolution in Italy and France, and therefore most likely finished off capitalism in Europe entirely had they been successful. And there's every reason to think that they could have been, given the size and the influence they had. But they decided ultimately, due to a rot inside of them, to become reformists and to become traitors. And that is the essential problem. The essential problem in the imperialist countries isn't that there hasn't been a will to fight on the part of the working class at various points. The problem is the issue of leadership, the issue of the labour aristocracy, which is the upper layers of the trade union movement, but also the better off end of the working class, which is happy to sell out for very little to maintain its relatively, and I do use that term advisedly, privileged position in the imperialist countries, to get a slightly bigger slice of the action from the imperialists, even if it's just for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. This layer is always the quickest to sell out, and unfortunately they all have been they have all condemned the communist movement in the Western nations to irrelevancy for a generation now. So that's our problem. The problem was that the imperialists found ways of co-opting and subordinating the allegedly Marxist and later allegedly Marxist-Leninist parties into the system via the provision of reforms and the incorporation of the leaders of the communists into the system. Fortunately, and on one level, this is a somewhat positive, shall we say. It's an example of what Mao called or described as turning a negative into a positive. The negative side of the system no longer being able to reform itself is that the power of the labour aristocracy and the power of the trade union leaders is diminishing all the time. And that is because reformism without reforms doesn't last very long. And so what you have in the Western countries now in the form of the social democracy is a bunch of reformist leaders promising reforms when no reforms will ever be forthcoming. The system cannot afford it anymore. On that, the capitalists are telling the truth. So, Dingo Ate Me Baby says, would have been a struggle with all the Operation Gladio operators hanging around the country. Yeah, it would have been. I mean, there's no doubt about that. But I would say that the Italian working class especially, post-World War II, was not only a working class which had had considerable success in waging an armed struggle towards the end of World War II against the Mussolini regime and against the occupying Nazis, but also the Italian working class actually, the Communist Party, kept caches of arms themselves until well into the 1950s. It was only when they did their shady deal with the Italian ruling class that they started to abandon those. But the Italian working class had a proud tradition of armed resistance. Again, this is not easy stuff. This is the kind of thing that, even if done successfully, costs lives and potentially means a civil war. And this is the problem with reformism and the reformist mindset. The reformists will recoil in horror at the civil war, but the reformist mindset, the reformist outlook, will lead you to, in the form of the working class into not a civil war, but losing a class war in a more low intensity fashion over many decades. And class warfare, whether it is high intensity or low intensity, leads to millions of working class deaths, millions of premature deaths, hundreds of thousands of more people dying of preventable diseases, deaths of despair, that kind of thing. Putin, in an interesting comment, said that the Russia in the 1990s was like a low-intensity war. Now, what he misses out on that is that it's a low-intensity class war, in that there was very little, other than the very beginning, direct shooting, but it was a relentless war upon the Russian working class in the terms of the destruction of their lives, their communities, their living standards. And ultimately, there was a cost to it, a cost of millions, which Russia is still suffering from to this day. So the reformists in Italy and in France and in Britain, in the form of the Communist Party leaders post-World War II, if asked about it, would have said, we have to avoid civil war. But civil war is with you, whether you would have it or not, in the form of the class war. The fact that you choose the low intensity version of that class war, or the lower intensity version of it, whereby the bulk of the working class just gets destroyed in a more slow fashion, whereas the upper end of the working class perhaps remains a little bit more protected, reveals the poverty of their vision and ultimately their cowardice. Right, it was a rather long digression, but I hope the answer satisfied. An Irish partisan hopes everyone's enjoying the music from the USSR, the DPRK, and socialist Yugoslavia. I hope you were all enjoying that indeed. So, two quick things to start off with. These have come up a lot. I mean, I've addressed the first one of these before, which is the constant comparisons, often made by Russians who should know better, between the collapse of the USSR and the steady implosion, shall we say, or erosion of US imperialism. And the comparison usually goes something like this, that the USSR towards the end was dominated by a bureaucracy that couldn't change, that was lying about everything, that had past it leaders who were completely out of touch with reality. And the collapse of the system was typified by Chernobyl, which was, according to the fictional TV series, which idiots everywhere assume is real, that was lied about to cover up a failing system. and now the USA is in the same place. That's my broad stroke description of this point of view. And I think it's a very shallow point of view. I think it doesn't actually do a lot of analysis as to the systems of each country. Now, the first thing I want to emphasize is that the collapse in the USSR took the Soviet nations and also the wider socialist bloc from a higher mode of production to a lower mode of production. And I mean by that, the successes that you see in the USSR and even in the more compromised, slightly more compromised form of the people's democracies are things that have been turned backwards by the restoration of capitalism. What you had in, of course, Russia and the wider Soviet, ex-Soviet sphere is a series of disasters, which I've just been talking about, in the form of deindustrialization and asset stripping, which sought to actually restore a much more parasitic and less productive economy than had existed previously. So, in that sense, of course, you're also dealing with the fact that even in the later 1980s, even up to the middle 1980s, there was still the survival of just enough of a proletarian dictatorship in a very compromised and watered down form to get in the way of Gorbachev's pro-capitalist so-called reforms, in reality counter-reforms. And that's why, of course, Gorbachev was desperate to get rid of the influence of the working class elements in the party, because they were a block upon his counter-revolution. So what happened in the USSR wasn't a collapse as such. It was a counter-revolution brought about by a restored bourgeois element that had grown in power over 30 years, that Stalin and Mao both identified in all socialist countries as being a risk, that Marx himself saw as a risk, that there would be a risk of restoration, which is why Marx talks about, after the overthrow of capitalism, you see an extended period that will be known as the dictatorship of the proletariat. It's why Lenin was so insistent upon the dictatorship of the proletariat, because bourgeois democracy, which people like Karl Kautsky were so keen on, is in essence a form of rule that is taken from the capitalist world. And so trying to incorporate that into a country which has undergone a proletarian revolution means you're incorporating capitalist forms of governance inside what is already a Soviet and workers' state. So essentially, the reason why Gorbachev was so keen on what he called democracy is that he was ushering in elements of the bourgeois dictatorship. Now, did he know that that was what he was doing? That's one for the biographies to duel about. There are people who will argue that he did. There are those that argue that he was just an idiot. But the actual objective reality is that Gorbachev was ushering in elements of the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie in his so-called glasnost and perestroika elements that he pursued in the 1980s. So what you have then is an older, more reactionary, backward-looking class being restored to power partly from without and partly from within. Partly the bourgeois class grew back inside the Soviet Union and grew to influence inside the party and ultimately created the opportunities for a Gorbachev figure to emerge. So that's why the Soviet Union collapses. It didn't just implode. It was a counter-revolution that grew out of a restoration of the bourgeoisie within the socialist system, hidden in many respects by that system, and also by a restoration of capitalist relations, which led to the growth of what Roger Kieran and Thomas Kenny described as a shadow economy. It would have been this grows from the 50s through to the 1980s. So you have a shadow bourgeoisie there. And you also have a bourgeoisie that wants to be restored from without, those descendants of the bourgeois that were chased out of the Soviet Union in the 20s and 30s. So you have a class that is restored to power by a counter-revolution that runs between 1985 and 1992 in the Soviet Union, and you have a similar process take place in the people's democracies in Yugoslavia. That's what happens. And so and this is why it's a shallow comparison. What you're facing in the United States isn't a counter-revolution. Like the rule of the British monarchy is not being restored in the United States. I know the LaRouchites believe it already has, or that they never escaped the British monarchy. But the revolution of 1776 is not being undone. The rule of Britain is not being restored. You're not getting a counter-revolution and a regression to a lower form of production in the United States as yet. What you're seeing in the United States, and this is why I object to these facile comparisons, is the breaking out of the, shall we say, the morbid symptoms of late stage imperialism, a fully realized imperialist system, which is what the United States is, moves to decay. And there's arguments about when this started. I would say that the decay period really began in the 60s, probably the middle 60s, by the time, of course, that the rate of profit drops and you start looking at the various maneuvers that the US bourgeois engage in to try and prolong their system, which fuel further financialization and deindustrialization, which is inherent in imperialism anyway. So you have a system here which is actually not undergoing a counter-revolution. It's a system which has reached its fullest potential development and is rotting away. I would argue that even with the all the problems that the Khrushchevite revisionists put in place in the Soviet Union, its problems even by the mid-80s could have been solved by people, both people at the top who were better and by a more politicized and more engaged working class. But even if the people at the top had just been more skilled, even in the manner of like a revisionist like Deng Xiaoping, it could have gone down differently. But we get into that, we'll be distracted too far. But the Soviet system, what the propagandists in the West want you to believe that, oh, it was completely rotten and couldn't possibly be reformed. That's untrue. The Soviet system was still producing a lot of innovation, even up to the middle 1980s. It was Gorbachev's so-called reforms which crashed the economy completely into a ditch by doing away with the planned economy all at once, and by, of course, allowing the capitalist element, the hidden capitalist element, to engage in unrestricted looting of the country. And that's due to the law on socialist enterprises, I believe, that he signed in 1989. And so what you have is the difference between a system which was overthrown from within and went through regression back to a lower level of economic organization, a lower level of production, and a system which has grown as far as it possibly can in terms of being the fullest expression of imperialism. So this is the difference, and this is why I object to the comparisons, because they're ahistorical. They're looking at like two things and saying, oh, well, Biden's old, Brezhnev was old, Chernenko was old. Well, it's kind of the same thing. But the rotting away of imperialism has nothing in common with the problems that were in the USSR, other than on the most shallow level. You can say, oh, well, there was a bureaucracy in both, and bureaucracies lie. Well, that doesn't really mean anything. You could also be referring to the late period of the Roman Empire. Still wouldn't tell you much about what was actually going on then. So this is the reason why I object to these things. It's shallow. It's not telling you anything about the historical realities of the late period USSR or what late period imperialism is. And you have to understand what late period imperialism actually is, because it's not just going to go away. Like, there's a lot of expectations now that the USA is going to break up into its constituent parts. I mean, don't rule it out, anything's possible, but I cannot see that happening. The US ruling class, as I was outlining in the program I did on Monday about the affordability of imperialism, US ruling class, if it undergoes the breakup of the United States, will be finished. If it can no longer claim to rule inside the continental United States, then its ability to export its capital around the world will be fatally compromised. So they're not going to accept that. There's also not going to be a counter-revolution, as I've already said, inside the United States. So the belief that it will just somehow implode, I think, is very naive. And I think a lot of these multipolar world enthusiasts think that US imperialism is just going to go away, fade away, go down, if not without a fight, then without a direct one. I think that's a dangerous assumption. I think if you're looking at this and thinking it's just going to fade, then you don't understand the viciousness of the American bourgeois. They will, at some point, I think, get their acts together and find themselves some leaders who are determined to reimpose themselves. And that's when we've all got real problems, because they will attempt to reimpose themselves via violence. Now, they might not succeed because, of course, they would have to overcome initially the objections of the US working class. They would need to restore profitability inside the United States by attacking the US working class. So there's a lot of barriers to the US bourgeois being able to re-establish themselves or re-stamp their authority on things. But they are going to try, and they are going to try in a way that will not be confused and compromised like the late period Soviet Union, because this is a class that will, whilst it has its divisions, will unify in defense of its interests. And this makes another difference with the Soviet Union, which is that the working class was supposed to be the ruling class, and it still had a certain amount of influence, as I said, but it was being displaced from power by a bourgeois element that came to dominate the system. You don't have that inside the United States. You have only the rule of the capitalist class, only the rule of capital, only the upsurge, only the revolution led by the American proletariat can get rid of US imperialism for good. And a lot of people think it's just going to fall away, it's going to implode. And you're going to see the independent Republic of Texas and Florida. This is not something that I think is likely in the immediate period. You're going to see American imperialism lurch further into crisis, and then it will attempt to reassert itself. And that's when things will get even more dangerous for us. So the assumption that things will just fall away, I think, are wrong. And that's why I think this comparison with the later period Soviet Union is wrong, because it misunderstands which class was in power in both countries and what a counter-revolution is and what a fully grown imperialist system is. Right, more comments in the chat. So I've got a question about the mafia bosses being put down by Lukashenko, coming in from Jonah, but this is answered by Irish Partisan. Good afternoon to Yepex, who's just joined us. Irish Partisan, I'll read out your comments because it's quite an interesting story. Irish Partisan says, Lukashenko began to crack down on local mafia class as soon as he was elected in 1994. The previous Liberal government began a policy of capitalist free market policies. Lukashenko stopped it. Irish Partisan continues, the period of Belarus 91 to 94 was marked by a period of economic and social chaos. Millions plunged into poverty. Lukashenko halted the mass deindustrialization and preserved Soviet-era industries. So therefore, Belarus escaped the mass deindustrialization, asset stripping and looting that happened in Ukraine. Belarus has a vibrant industrial, manufacturing and agricultural sector. So there you go. If only more countries had had a Lukashenko figure is the answer to that question. Divim Ma'av says, hello, Italia would have had a Chile scenario, no chance for a revolution. I disagree with you. I think that the Chile scenario, if you think about it, why was it possible? Was it because the Chilean working class weren't capable of fighting? No, that's not true. They showed a lot of determination to fight for socialism. Was it the case that the Chilean reaction was just too powerful? Well, in the case of this, I would refer you to the article written by Enver Hoxha, just after the overthrow of Allende, when I've got disagreements with the way that Hoxha saw things and the way that Hoxhaists see things. But in that article, it's available on the Marxist Internet Archive, he makes a very correct point, which is that in Chile, the reason why Pinochet was able to succeed, aside from, of course, the machinations of the imperialists and the brutality of the Chilean reaction, was because Allende, for all his personal bravery, repeatedly restrained the working class and repeatedly denied the need for revolution, denied the need to overthrow the ruling class and smash its state. He thought it could be reformed away. And that's exactly the same problems that the Italian Communist Party had. They fought the same thing, which is why they ended up becoming Euro-communists. So, yes, there's a chance if you embark on the revolutionary road that it's going to go wrong and that the reaction will stomp your head in and you will end up dead. It's not a revolutionary is not an occupation that is to be pursued by people who enjoy a safe life. There's every chance that you will pay the ultimate price for it, but there's also every chance that the working class can win and can overcome the reaction. So I don't accept your interpretation there. Good evening to Burke and Slava. Tony says, Jackson Hinkle is reporting that the Palestinian Authority is prepared to rule over Gaza by the USA. Well, I don't doubt that that's a plan that the US has got. I've heard that plan be mentioned on numerous occasions. The problem that they've got, though, I've heard that the British have sent some sort of special forces team in there to prepare the ground for the coming of the Palestinian Authority. The problem that they've got there, though, is that and this brings us to a brief discussion of the Gaza war. The problem that they've got is that the Israelis aren't winning. And to restore the puppet Palestinian Authority, they would need to drive out the Palestinian National Liberation Forces, and they're not doing that. The Israelis aren't meeting their objectives. The objectives of the Palestinian National Liberation Forces was to bring the Israelis into Gaza and then trap them and inflict mass casualties on them. And from what I can tell, it's always difficult to tell when looking at videos and accounts coming out of Gaza, they are certainly achieving the casualties in terms of the level of casualties they're inflicting upon the Israeli forces. This is why the Israelis have done this mass roundup of men in the northern part of Gaza, who they've done the usual traditional thing where they strip all these guys naked and herd them into a truck and humiliate them as much as possible. Same thing the US was doing in Guantanamo Bay and in Abu Ghraib. And the Israeli propagandists are saying, look, Hamas fighters are coming out of the tunnels and surrendering en masse, which isn't happening. If you look at the age of the Hamas fighters who've done all this work so far, these are guys like 18, 19, 20, like early to mid 20s at the most. Like the guys they've got stripped and sitting on the floor are guys in like their later 40s, 50s, older. So they are not the guys hiding out in a tunnel for months on end. To do that, you need to be relatively young and very fit. And no insult to these men that these Israelis had lined up. These guys looked like they were older, and they were not the kind of men who could have lasted hiding underground for months on end, for 2 months now, and moving constantly and fighting. That's the game of a very young man. And most of the guys that they've lined up and photographed in the nude aren't that. It's not a matter of insulting anybody. It's just a matter of the way these things are. So what the Israelis are doing is they're staging fake outs. The reason why they've lined up all these guys, stripped them and photographed them and driven them out to a desert and had them kneel down in front of what appears to be the preparation of a mass grave, whether they've actually done the killings or not, I don't know. But the reason why they're doing that is so that they can put the picture on Israeli social media and say, look, Hamas is surrendering, we've caught them. And they have to do the fake out because they're not winning. So Nasrallah was right, and the Palestinian resistance forces were right in that the Israelis cannot achieve their objectives, which is why the war that they are waging is so targeted at mass civilian casualties. It's a war aimed at terrorizing the civilian population, and also it's a war motivated by impotence and humiliation. Every time the Israeli forces have an encounter with the Palestinians, man to man, they lose. They have severe casualties inflicted upon them. Palestinian fighters sneak into Israeli camps, plant mines, sneak out again, blow loads of them up. They get hit from multiple angles by rocket-propelled grenades and anti-tank weapons. Many of their tanks are burnt, and many of their men are dead. and many more are hospitalized. So to do what I don't doubt that the installing the Abbas regime, as Tony mentions, is something they want to do. The question is, do they have the capability of doing it? And at the moment, the answer is no. At the moment, the Israelis are losing. They're inflicting a lot of casualties, as imperialist forces always do. Even when they lose, they manage to inflict huge levels of casualties. In every anti-colonial war in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, the imperialist powers, even when they were losing, were still able to use their air forces, their weapons of mass destruction, to kill an awful lot of people as they went out. And that's what Israel's doing now. Israel is fucked. Might not be today or tomorrow, but long term it is finished. The shots fired on October the 7th marked something of a starting gun towards the end of Israel. And what you're seeing now is this playing out. So there'll be all kinds of plans to do this, to expel the Palestinians into the Sinai, to force the Arab countries to take them as refugees, which they're resolutely not doing. Not because these regimes like Egypt and the King of Jordan and the Saudis are particularly friends of the Palestinian struggle. They're not. They're terrified of the consequences if they're seen to be openly collaborating with the Israeli regime, though. Oz says, I doubt the Brits will rise up anytime soon. They aspire to be their overlords too much. Oh, ouch, Oz, you wound me. Well, personally speaking, I don't aspire to be David Cameron. My God, no. There's a certain element of truth in what you say, which is that it is part of the bourgeois ideology in the imperialist countries to make certain elements of the working class want to and aspire to be like the ruling class. That's part of social engineering. That's part of the propaganda system. So there's an element in truth in what you say, and the same would be true in France, Germany, certainly the United States, Canada, Australia, all the imperialist countries. There's elements of that. The problem is, though, that again, the scope of the ruling class to be able to offer even the illusion of that is going away. Even the consumerist lifestyle that was available in the 1990s is going away slowly. So the ability of people to afford it is going away. That's why you see Amazon offering a payment by installments service on like things as cheap as like a tenner. Or maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration, or like £20 to £30, pay on instalments. Their ability to provide wage increases that keep pace with price increases has gone. Their only solution to everything now is more credit. And their only solution to the problems faced by British imperialism is to print more money and to try and secure another house price boom. That's, by the way, Keir Starmer's economic policy. That and subsidies for fraudulent green industries. So this is the problem that they've got. This social aspiration, so we say, this desire to be like the bourgeois. That's a real thing, and it's has its roots back in the 1960s, I would say, and it's something to be taken seriously. But what I would say is that when that loses its capacity to convince anymore, when it loses all touch with material reality, then, and as it is now, then you start to see more interesting developments taking place. So I would keep an eye on the imperialist countries. The masses, even when you think that they're either bored off or dormant, always retain the ability to surprise us. So, Oz, apparently you're a Brit yourself, so you're self-insulting. Well, let's commiserate together. Right, hello to HM down there in Brighton, I believe. Irish Partisan says, President Maduro announced today that all Western oil companies operating in the disputed territories in Guyana have to cease operations in 3 months. Meanwhile, US Southcom conducted flights today in Guyana. Maduro was reportedly due to fly to Moscow very shortly to meet Putin. Interesting. We might as well get into that then, given where things are. There's all kinds of stories swirling around about what's going to go on in the Essequibo region. As to what is actually going to happen, I mean, I don't want to make too many predictions on this until I've finished my research. So I'm going to do a specific video on this. I didn't have time to do that today. I mean, I think that, well, first of all, the US imperialists, as has been observed by multiple military analysts, one of the reasons they didn't manage to overthrow Chavismo or the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela is because invading Venezuela, if you couldn't inspire a military revolt or a coup, would have been too difficult for them to do. So the problem for US imperialism there was without a reliable puppet in the form of Juan Guaido, who wasn't a reliable puppet, then they found intervention in Venezuela too difficult to pull off. The other side of that, should we say, the blade cuts both ways on that, though, which is the Venezuelans have a pretty good military system, both in terms of regular army, reserve forces, and, of course, around at least a couple of million people under arms in the revolutionary militia units that were formed under the advice of Castro. So in terms of defense, the Venezuelan revolution, the Bolivarian Revolution, has a very strong defense. Can its armed forces actually go on the offensive if US imperialism tries to intervene to, I won't say defend Guyana, I'm going to say defend the profits of ExxonMobil? That's a more difficult question. I don't know what conversation has been had with the Russian government about this, whether Maduro is going there to have that conversation. Who knows? So I still interpret the referendum at this stage as being about giving the Venezuelan government more of a moral weight to speak on the subject, claiming a mandate from the masses. So whether that's going to translate into some sort of military action, I don't know. I'm not completely convinced that it will at this stage, but we will have to see. Maybe Maduro's decided that the time has come to put an end to this. Maybe the pushing of the Guyanan puppet government into being ever more of an open stooge of US imperialism is sort of a final straw there. I don't know at this stage whether that's going to be the final straw towards breaks the patience of the Venezuelans. What I do know is that the way in which, of course, the large numbers of the American and the British left have responded to this is deeply foolish, claiming that it's Venezuela is somehow imperialist now. I mean, it's completely stupid. I'll go into the reasons more in a specific video about it, but at this stage I would say that I still see the referendums and the talk coming from Venezuela as something which is designed to force a negotiation. Now, of course, Vladimir Putin is very familiar with what happens when people make talk to try and force a negotiation. If the other party is wholly under the control of US imperialism, and US imperialism wants there to be a war, because they think that they can capitalize on it to secure regime change, then there'll be a war, and there'll be an extended war as the puppet will do what he's told. So there's every chance that this strategy doesn't come off in the way that Maduro wants. I'm sure that Putin will have plenty to say on the subject. We'll have to wait and see what that looks like. The other thing I wanted to mention today was, of course, the actions of Mr. Sir Keir Starmer, and his recent praise of the deceased and late and unlamented Margaret Thatcher. And I wrote an article on this on the website recently, where there was a question's been raised about, like, well, why does Starmer praise Thatcher? And as I said in the article, it's all about, in part, doing a remix of the Tony Blair years. Tony Blair was always doing these sort of fake taboo breaking events, like praising Rupert Murdoch, praising Thatcher, stuff that tickles the fancy of the ruling class. But there's that. He wants to be just like Blair, but unlike Blair, Starmer is a terrible actor and a man who cannot deal with even the mildest of situations that require him to think on his feet, which is strange for a lawyer. But there was a very humiliating video that came out, two humiliating videos. One where someone on a train, he's in first class, of course, walks up to him and asks him why he doesn't back a ceasefire in Gaza, and Starmer just sort of sits there and goes, and doesn't really say anything. Then he's at Glasgow station and there's Palestine solidarity protesters surround him, start chanting at him. He looks like he's going to shit himself. I mean, it is gratifying to see. I mean, I believe it was Ash who made the comment on the Telegram channel discussion forum that often it's hard to see the point of going up to politicians and like sticking your finger in their faces and making a noise and trying to make fools out of them. But I think the fact that the crime that Starmer is backing is so monstrous, and also the fact that they keep trying to hide their responsibility. Like, the more that they can be thrown in their face, the better, especially when they're so bad at dealing with it and look so stupid and cowardly and ridiculous. It should be done to Starmer every single chance that people get to do it to him. And so, going back to the reason why he's done it, though, he's an incredibly bad politician. He's made a whole career basically out of grovelling to the next guy above him in the chain of command. And seeing as how he's now at the top of the Labour Party, the next guy above him in the chain of command is, well, Tony Blair, who is a direct representative of the British ruling class and the British ruling class themselves. And so what do they want out of a Labour Party leader? Well, they want a guy who, whilst not doing anything fundamental to change the system, at least he's able to preserve the illusion of change in the minds of the working class. So Starmer's not doing very well at that so far. But what they want is somebody who will lead the party of the party of the trade union bureaucracy and use the relationship with the trade union bureaucracy to squash any militant struggle that might emerge from the ranks of the trade union movement. That's what the Labour Party is for. To be a reliable second 11 for British capitalism, to present the illusion of change whilst in actual fact waging the class war upon the working class just as relentlessly as any Tory administration would, but with the active assistance of the trade union bureaucracy in selling out the working class and making sure it's confused, demoralised and divided. That's the purpose of the Labour Party and always has been. So, why is Starmer praising Thatcher, to go back to the point again? Well, the biggest issue is the reason why the ruling class still loves Thatcher so much is because they see her as being their saviour. And why is she their saviour? Well, principally, in the heart of the issue is that Thatcher was the one at the top, she was the person in charge, when the most militant elements of the British working class that I was mentioning before were defeated in the form of the National Union of Mine Workers in 84 to 85. That's when the most threatening elements, the real vanguard of the British working class, the most politically conscious, the most militant, the ones with the strongest traditions of struggle, and also with a real, at that stage, economic lever that they could use in terms of the ability to affect domestic power generation. Now, I read in a book called Ghost Dancers by a former NUM official called Dave Douglas that for all the talk about the strike not affecting the power stations, it came a lot closer to affecting the power stations than we're led to believe. The government only just got away with it. But to go back to the reason why they love Thatcher so much, Thatcher represents to them the triumph over working class militancy. That's what Thatcher really represents at heart. And so when Keir Starmer goes on and does some execrable interview where he stammers through his praise for her, what he's doing is that he is committing to the ruling class that he will keep the effects of that defeat in place. That he will use all the powers at his disposal as the leader of the so-called Labour Party to make sure that the working class never emerges again in the threatening form of some kind of new version of the NUM, or that the militancy that they represented will not be recreated, will not come back. So what he's doing is he's committing himself very publicly to the preservation of the most important part of the Thatcher legacy, which is to make sure that the defeat inflicted upon the most organised and determined sections of the class is kept in place. That's what he's actually committing to do. Beyond all the froth you get in the press, and the anger from like the left of what's left of the Labour Party and the broader left in Britain towards Starmer, whilst it's understandable, is also very naive, because whereas Thatcher and Blair would come out and openly praise Thatcher, whereas Blair and Starmer go out and actually praise Thatcher, Kinnock actually collaborated with Thatcher. He just didn't do it absolutely openly. And Callaghan and Wilson helped prepare the ground for Thatcher. So all the Labour leaders are implicated in the class war that the working class lost in the 1980s. And without the active assistance of Wilson and Callaghan and Kinnock, the Thatcher government wouldn't have been able to win. So again, the reason why people get angry with Starmer is that they're still holding on to this illusion that there was a time when the Labour Party was actually on the side of the working class. It never was. At most you could say about it is that it's relentlessly on the side of the trade union bureaucracy. That's the only thing you could say about it if you even regard that as a positive. It's never been on the side of the working class. It has delivered some things that have benefited the working class, but only, as we've covered many times before, in circumstances where revolution was the only other choice available and in front of the ruling class. So, Starmer, entirely predictable behaviour. Whether it works for him and he gets into office or not is another question. Even if he does get into office, it will be a Pyrrhic victory that won't last too long. Right. Oz says, the culture hegemony theory explains why citizens of imperialist nations inspire to be their overlords. Well, I will just repeat the words of Marx, which is that the ruling ideas of any epoch are the ideas of the ruling class, and the flip from in the 19th century, which was that the ruling class would tell the working class to know their place. That, of course, flips when you get post-World War II and the ruling class has to change its messaging. And so it adopts the more American version of that, which is that anybody can become the ruling class, which, of course, isn't true. But the ruling idea becoming more typically more radically liberal helps the ruling class get through the crisis of the post-1965 period by being able to repurpose feelings of frustration and anger that some workers had with the system and turn them into a wave of support for sort of Thatcher and Reagan that a minority of the working class voted for out of so-called social aspiration. HM says, I may have missed it, but have you released the episode about the falling rate of profit yet? No, I haven't, because I haven't finished writing it yet. When I finish writing it, it will be put together and released. Irish Partisan says, what do you think about the news from the US regarding the cancellation of funds for Ukraine? Polish military intelligence has stated that it predicts a big Russian move this winter. Well, I think that the wrangle in the US Senate has come about, well, for many reasons, but the principal reason behind the wrangling over Ukraine is the fact that Ukraine is losing. And there is now a row going on in the ruling class of the United States and their political representatives as to, well, how to get out. Now, Biden and Blinken and Admiral Kirby, have been on various different news platforms saying, well, we might end up in a fight with the Russians directly if Putin triumphs. Essentially, they keep trying to conjure up this completely false image that the Russian army is just going to keep on rolling to Warsaw and then on to Berlin, which they're not going to do. There's no indication whatsoever that the Russians are remotely interested in that. Putin is still saying from time to time, I mean, he greeted a bunch of new ambassadors the other day, and he said the new German ambassador was there, and he chronicled the decline in relations with Germany and said it was a tragedy and that restoration of relations would still be possible. Because again, like the Russians made plenty of money selling oil and gas to Germany. They would like that relationship restored. So again, like Biden's peddling all kinds of fantasies at the moment. He's trying to whip support for restoring the funding to Ukraine in the fearing that if it's not done, then they'll get a collapse. Now, of course, priority for the bipartisan priority in the political system of US imperialism is funding for Israel. That's without question. Now, the Ukraine question, I think that a certain section of US imperialism has decided that this is now a lost cause. Now, the only row now is not whether it is a lost cause. I think all of them probably know it in deep down. The row is about, well, how quickly do we let the air out the tires on this one? Now, from the point of view of naked political opportunism, which should never be underestimated, the Republicans, or some of them at least, seem to be gravitating to the point of view that, well, okay, Ukraine's a lost cause. Let's hang this one round Biden's neck and move on to something else. I mean, the priority for a lot of these guys is the preservation of the US's presence in West Asia, of which Israel is a key component. So them prioritizing Israel there is not a surprise, nor should it be a surprise that they've decided that, well, we can hang this one around Biden's neck and then old Joe gets packed off to retirement. Because you notice also that the negative stories about Biden are now amplifying throughout the US bourgeois press. Clearly, there's a section of the US ruling class who have decided this isn't it. This guy's fucked. Let's hang the whole thing around him and move on. So Johnson, the new Speaker of the House of Representatives, he's a scumbag, but he's a guy who apparently has some idea of what he's doing. There seems to be now a move to get the Israel funding and the border wall funding and the Ukraine funding all in one package and put that through. Now, the advantage of that from the Republican Party's point of view is, first of all, if the Ukraine funding fails, then they know that the Senate Democrats will agree to cut the Israel funding out of that bill and send a separate bill through in the end, especially if the Israelis get desperate. So they know that they've got that nailed down. They can get that through separately really anytime they want, and then the Democrats will in the end agree to it. However, if they manage to get the border wall funding attached to this Ukraine package, and even if that passes, that also fucks the Democrats, because then Biden has to put his name on a border wall bill, and Trump's border wall becomes Biden's border wall going into the election year. And that will fuck the Democrats completely. They've already alienated the youth vote, shall we say, the sort of more petty bourgeois radical left vote that turned out for the Democrats in 2020, because a lot of them fell for the bad orange man fascist propaganda, and that Trump was orange Hitler. Well, that now Biden is putting his name on a bill which builds orange Hitler's wall. So from the point of view of the Republicans, that's a win-win scenario. They can say that they've built the wall and that Biden paid for it, or Biden signed off on it, and it will completely fuck the Democrats going into the elections next year. So from the narrow political point of view, all of this makes sense. And from the broader point of view, the fact that even the likes of Mitt Romney and Lindsey Graham are prepared to now play hardball with Biden over Ukraine funding says that they have been told, these people, because they don't have any original ideas of their own, they've been told, I think, the truth about what's actually going on. I think that they've been taken aside, probably by the CIA, and have been told, well, Senator Romney, Senator Graham, this is actually what's going on. This is the reality of the Ukrainian losses. This is the reality of the Russian strength. This is the reality of the forces that the Russians have available to them. And this is what it would take to actually prevent the Russians from conquering however much they want of what is left of Ukraine. And most of them will have seen that, and even a US senator is intelligent enough to put the sums together when it's presented to him in a clear piece of A4, probably with pictures. So I think they've decided that it's over. And whether Zelensky ends up fleeing to Argentina under the pretext of attending Chainsaw Milai's inauguration or not is another question. But certainly Ukraine is finished, and now everybody knows it. As for a big Russian move this winter, I'm in two minds about it, to be honest, to answer the latter part of Irish Partisan's question. On the one hand, you could see the sense in it. The Russians certainly have the men in reserve to carry out some kind of big maneuver. Whether the Russian leadership is still waiting for a complete Ukrainian collapse is another question. Whether the Ukrainian state just implodes or whether they move to make it implode, I think that's the question. It's not a matter of them not having the forces. They clearly do. The only subject that needs addressing is, well, how far are they going to go and when are they going to go? So do they wait and see this winter if the Ukrainian state implodes and the Americans pull the support for it? I mean, I'm still, as I say, I'm still up in the air in terms of making a decision on whether they will go all out, the Senate Republicans and the House Republicans, and yank support from Ukraine completely, or whether they will let a lower amount go through and basically not put it not put it in Ukraine in a situation where everything just explodes all at once. Because I don't think that's what the more serious people in US imperialism want. If that happens, then they'll look bad as well. I mean, even if they want to hang it around Biden's neck, it's still going to damage US imperialism as a whole, seeing this project explode, or I should say implode. So let's just tease out a couple of scenarios. If the Congress passes something which screws the Democrats because Biden's signing off on a border wall, then if they pass something, even if it's a lower amount for Ukraine, then there's every chance that the Ukrainian government staggers on for another few months, which I think that is what I think the Democrats want. If nothing gets passed, then things start imploding. Then the Russians may make a move that is more ambitious if what they're doing is essentially driving up and taking the surrender of Ukrainian forces, which may be on the cards. So again, a lot of this depends upon if the Ukrainian government continues to hold together. If it holds together with a semblance of unity, then there's a chance that things continue on in the same grim way they are at the moment, with thousands of casualties being inflicted by the Russians on the Ukrainians every single day. The kind of thing for Ukraine is if the funding just gets pulled, the government implodes and the Russians just roll as far as they want, and the Ukrainians just surrender en masse, with the Banderites and the open fascists being isolated and running away. That would be the best scenario. Given the way things are turning out this year, though, I doubt that that will be the best scenario. I think that the Americans will get something passed that keeps the Kiev regime on the road for another few weeks, and that the Americans will keep it going so that the Russians have to attack to finish it off. That's my speculation for now. I'm always prepared to reassess this in light of new information now. Zim Left Radio asks if there's a playlist of the introductory music. There isn't, but I will make one. HM asks, what is the name of your new football podcast? Good to have an alternative to the almost unlistenable liberal-dominated pods. Well, it's a Class Consciousness Project production, HM, coming out early next week. We may make it a monthly edition. I mean, I know what you mean about the liberal ones. I mean, I used to listen to the Athletic podcast, but I just had to switch that off. I found that unbearable. I used to listen to the Guardian podcast way back in the day. I wouldn't even want to listen to that now. God knows what that sounds like. So if it's popular, we may make it a regular feature. Class Consciousness Project looks at football. When it comes out, let me know what you think. So, Dingo Ate Me Baby says, on the Venezuela issue, I heard the final story is America's going to put a base there surrounding them on both sides because the base is in Colombia as well. Excellent point. Even with Petro in charge, nominally in charge of Colombia, of course, the American imperialists still have a heavy military presence there. So we'll have to see how that goes. If it's the case that Maduro is going to go to Putin and say, look, I can't be surrounded on two sides by the Americans, who I know are going to try again to do a regime change job on me, I asked for your backing in doing this. Interesting to see how the Russians cut it, to be honest. Maduro will say he has his referendum result, and it's a referendum result that's heavily in favor of any action he needs to take. So we'll see. Maybe the Venezuelan plan is to act quickly before the US has a chance to establish itself, and then basically dare the US to bomb or invade them. Maybe that's the idea. But again, I'm going to do a specific video on this tomorrow. So, notes for me to take away. I need to put together a playlist of these tunes, so I certainly will do that. And I'll be back again at the same time tomorrow. I had to start a little bit late today due to getting back late. But I'll be back with you again tomorrow. Keep an eye out for the video on the history of the Essequibo crisis. And thank you to everybody who's tuned in and joined in with the chat. Good to see you all here as always. I will see you all